and Homeless Committee. We are doing a joint informational briefing with the Committee of Education. Chair Woodson is on his way. Unfortunately, he had some uh, airplane delays, but he'll be joining us very shortly. So on behalf of the Committee on Health, Human Services, and Homelessness, as well as the Committee of Education, we'd like to welcome everybody to participate in today's informational briefing. For the audience to know that we are using the interim 2021 legislative session membership to be participatory in the committees. So we have a lot of new members here present today. And so on behalf of us old timers, we would like to welcome all of them to the legislature. Um, so the format is going to be, we're going to be allowing four entities to do presentations. And then following that presentations, we will be opening it up for questions. So members, if you have questions, please open your chat box. Make sure you are identified and who you would like to identify the question to, and then type in the question and we will take them in the order. Any questions that are not addressed during this time frame will then be compiled by Majority Leader Baladi and then submitted to the director for answers, and then that will be forwarded to all the members. Okay, so without further ado, then I would like to turn it over to our first presenter, the Executive Office of Early Learning. Director.
Good morning, chairs, committee members, and representatives. Thank you for this opportunity to present on the early learning programs in Hawaii through the pandemic. May I ask for the slide deck to be pulled up? Thank you. We're here to talk about each of our programs and how we've fared during the pandemic, as well as where we'll go from here. We'll undoubtedly share with you about the challenges and threats that each of us have faced. The early learning care and education sector is not unique, and we've faced enormous obstacles during this pandemic. But before we get into some of those details, I'd like to set the stage of what the pandemic has been like for the early care and education sector more broadly. Although we've faced numerous challenges and threats, we've also persevered. Okay, we can advance to the next slide. The novel coronavirus first arrived in Hawaii in March, and by the middle of the month, Governor Ige had announced a stay-at-home order. During this time, schools and businesses were closed, and all non-essential activities had come to a stop. But one of the unsung heroes during these early days were our childcare providers. Next slide, please. Under the original stay-at-home order, childcare was deemed as an essential business. A number of childcare providers remained open so that our first responders and essential workers, like those working to feed us in restaurants and keeping shelves restocked at the grocery stores, had someone to watch their young children. Other organizations, such as Kama'aina Kids and YMCA, either pivoted existing programs or developed new programs to care for our older children in kindergarten through 6th grade. Next slide, please. By May, as we as a state prepared to reopen, the early childhood sector continued as unsung heroes. The Department of Human Services, or DHS, worked with the state legislature and the early childhood community to put forth guidelines to help providers reopen and begin caring for more children. DHS also administered contracts and later grants through the Hawaii Community Foundation in order to support our providers with much needed funds. The department also filed for multiple waivers so that Child Care Connection Hawaii could be offered to more families as well as providers who needed that help. Next slide, please. During the summer, the public pre-kindergarten program in EOEL and charter schools planned their way forward. The public pre-kindergarten program prioritized face-to-face learning when and wherever safe and possible. And the charter schools also developed plans of their own. In August, our public pre-kindergarten classrooms were largely open for in-person learning. Many charter school pre-kindergarten classrooms also opened for in-person learning at that time. Next slide, please. Some programs have not had the capacity or resources to open for in-person services, but that doesn't mean that they haven't continued to serve Hawaii's families. Some family-child interaction learning programs and some of the Head Start classrooms that were unable to open in person have embraced family engagement virtually. These are areas where they've led the way even prior to the pandemic, and now they're finding innovative ways to maintain these strengths into a new virtual world. They've created practices that allow them to guide parents and caregivers so that they can better support their children. And this is really critical as we've seen that the stress of the pandemic impacts young children as well as their parents. Next slide, please. I've worked in the early childhood sector for years now, and I can tell you that the professionals who make up our sector are extremely humble individuals. They would never want to brag, but today as we begin, I'd like to acknowledge my colleagues who will be presenting. They and their staff have all been putting in extensive hours, often in ways that stretch them incredibly thin. They've been kept up working and worrying about how Hawaii's youngest children and their families have been managing. To be sure, they've been facing numerous obstacles, and enormous ones at that. And they haven't overcome all of those obstacles. Sadly, we've lost some of our providers because of the pandemic. And we've even had to say goodbye to a couple of pillars in our community just within the last few months. For all of these difficulties, our early childhood sector has emerged with examples of resilience, success in the face of tremendous pressure, ingenuity, and perseverance. I'm proud to work with such amazing community members and leaders. Through this pandemic and even prior, the state legislature has invested in the early child care and education sector. We hope that you can see in this snapshot and through our presentation that your investment in our sector has gone a long way. Next slide, please. I'd like to switch gears now from the bigger picture to the EOEL Public Pre-Kindergarten Program. EOEL is a state agency who's charged with coordinating the early childhood system. In addition to this system coordination, we also administer the state's public pre-kindergarten program. So I'd like to dive into some of the work that we've been doing during the pandemic. Next slide, please. From the beginning of the pandemic, EOEL has embraced its functions to coordinate and collaborate. We put together information for families in the early days of the pandemic when many providers, including our own program, are closed. This included a website that targeted families as well as young children and expanded to include care and education providers as well. We also gathered fellow agencies and community partners to collaborate and coordinate on multiple fronts, including getting information out regarding subsidies and gathering input from providers and more. And finally, we've worked to move forward and adapt existing plans for realities during a pandemic. And as we look ahead to a post-pandemic world. One of the things guiding us through the pandemic is a goal that our work as EOEL and collectively should strengthen the sector in a way that maintains essential services for young children, rebuilds pieces that have been impacted, and improve processes and practices. Next slide, please. Our coordination and collaboration functions are always complemented by the administration of the EOEL Public Pre-Kindergarten Program. The pandemic has certainly changed the way we administer the program, and I'll get into details of how we've approached reopening and operating during the pandemic. But at this time, I'd like to provide you with a snapshot of where we are now. Capacity at this time is reduced as we ensure that teachers and educational assistants can safely care for and educate our 4-year-olds in person. As a result, our enrollment this year is at 55% of what our capacity would have been without the pandemic. This lower capacity is a result of our prioritization for face-to-face or in-person learning. In order to address physical distancing requirements, we've needed to ensure that there would be adequate space in order to distance the children, in addition to other considerations that I'll get into. Almost every school, 85%, are educating students in person at this time. Next slide, please. Some legislators have asked how COVID-19 has impacted our operations. So I think it's important that I provide an overview with how we've planned for and executed our reopening strategy. The EOEL public pre-kindergarten program classrooms closed with EOE schools in March and planned for reopening during the summer. We approached our reopening plans with a promise to stay grounded in what we know about children, families, and the early years while recognizing the impact of COVID-19. You'll see in the diagram that at the heart of our plans were families. From there, we were influenced by an ever broader context, which included the communities where our classrooms are located, the reopening guidelines that DHS and the community has set, and a world where COVID-19 now impacts everything that we do. Next slide, please. As we prepared for our classrooms for in-person learning, we took into consideration a number of factors, including the emotional and physical health, as well as safety needs of children and our staff, what the appropriate level of supervision of children would be while engaging with children as they learn and work together, and recognizing the need for ongoing assessment of and needed support for children, families, teaching staff, and the school. Next slide, please. From these considerations, we planned for the safe reopening of classrooms for mostly in-person learning. Each classroom would be made up of 10 children with 1 teacher and 1 educational assistant. In our classrooms, children and teachers all wear masks. Teachers work with children on increased hand washing and physical distancing, and all classrooms use temperature and health screenings as well. We also built into our reopening the need for flexibility. This applied to schedules, grouping arrangements, transitions, family needs, and the needs of each school community. Classrooms have all received PPE and cleaning supplies, which were provided through the EOEL's budget. And where a school was unable to provide in-person learning, either for a short or long term, we distributed picture books and math game packets to support at-home learning. Next slide, please. Reopening hasn't been without its challenges. Some were temporary, while others were ongoing even today. The 3 main challenges that come to mind are first, managing the emotional and physical well-being of staff and educators with less social connection and support. Staff must maintain these things while striving to provide effective learning environments that young children need throughout an evolving landscape. Next, EOEL struggles to provide the level and depth of professional learning related guidance. This is especially true for newer schools. As you remember, the legislature appropriated funds previously to open 10 new classrooms. Those 10 classrooms opened this year, and we're having to support them through this first year more virtually than in person. This also applies to ongoing professional learning and coaching we provide to all of our educators, which is a staple of our highly rated program. We currently provide most of the professional learning support in the form of short online sessions. And finally, it can be difficult with long hours and so much work to engage in collaboration and coordination, especially because this work is complex and multidimensional. It's been challenging to sustain work efforts given the limited time frame afforded by online connections. And given that our work is grounded in a partnership with the schools, we also want to be mindful of sustaining efforts in collaboration, learning conversations, and joint planning. Next slide, please. As we move forward, we look to maximize opportunities and provide certain things. First, we actively acknowledge the challenges our staff and educators face to provide meaningful experiences for both children as well as families. We acknowledge this work in the face of evolving professional expectations, as well as ongoing need for self-care. Next, we recognize our opportunities and strength so that we can reimagine, rethink, and re-engage. And finally, we're working to transition the few remaining virtual public pre-kindergarten program classrooms to in-person learning. Specifically, we're looking to move the 85% to 95% in January. So we're looking for all but one school offering in-person learning on campus during the third quarter. At this point, I'd like to ask Divan Lau, the interim executive director of the Hawaii State Public Charter School Commission, to provide an overview of how COVID-19 has impacted their pre-kindergarten programs.
Thank you, Lauren. Good morning, everyone, Chair, Vice Chair, members of the committee. Thank you so much for allowing us to share with you the challenges that public charter schools have experienced in our early learning programs. If I could have the slide deck advanced to, I think, 2 slides forward. There we go. Thank you so much. So currently we have 20% less seats available due to the physical distancing requirements from all of our classrooms. We've had a nearly 30% decrease in enrollment, like our EOEL classrooms compared to last year. We have lost about 20 students since the start of this school year. 18 of the 20 exited the program, did so due to fears of COVID-19. Our hardest hit school was on Molokai at Kuala Pu'u, with 8 students leaving the program due to COVID-19 concerns. Of the classrooms providing face-to-face instruction, 66% of those classrooms are operating at reduced hours. Despite COVID-19 and its challenges, our schools are maintaining the 1 teacher and 1 educational assistant per class. Next slide, please. So, of our 17 classrooms, 70% of them are offering virtual instruction, 12% are hybrid, what we call a half in-person, half online, and then 18% are operating face-to-face instruction. These are really decisions that we have left to each of our principals and their governing boards based on the conditions on the ground and the COVID-19 infection rates. As you know, every island is slightly different, so we've been able to allow our schools to make those decisions based on what's best for their community and their needs. Next slide, please. And so for the majority of our classrooms, they're working with a virtual learning model. And as we know, for our youngest learners, this is quite the challenge. At the heart of that challenge, our teachers are really doing amazing jobs of piecing that together and teaching in ways that they had not been prepared for. And so what does that look like? So our teacher really deals with 4 components. Traditionally, we've always understood learning to happen in small groups within classrooms. And so for those who are online, they're doing it in small groups as well. And then, of course, we know that we can't have our youngest learners online for an 8-hour school day. So obviously, there has to be some learning on their own. And so with independent learning, teachers have been preparing lesson plans and activities for students that they can do on their own at home with their parents or guardians. And so again, that also includes a lot more family engagement support to help our parents and their guardians help their students and their learners learn independently. And of course, there's always individual student support that our teachers reach out to each of the students to provide that individual support and to try to maintain as much normalcy as possible given the conditions on the ground. So that's the virtual learning model that our charter schools have been working hard to piece together. Next slide, please. And of course, I'm sure for those of you who have children who have been on distance learning, you understand that teachers are doing their best, but it's very, very stressful. It's very difficult. And our teachers and our EAs need our support. So we have been providing that, like EOEL, with virtual delivery of professional development, which are shorter and more frequent. We provide professional development that focuses on effective and developmentally appropriate virtual learning instruction for their students and their ohana. And of course, any changing, evolving COVID-19 guidelines that need to be understood and shared amongst all the teachers. So we've been continuing that professional development support on an ongoing basis, and it's been very, very effective, and I think much needed. Next slide, please. Lastly, challenges that our schools have been facing. You know, a lot of our charter schools are in rural areas, and finding qualified substitute teachers without COVID has been a challenge. And as you can imagine now with COVID, it has been even more difficult with that pool being reduced significantly. Additionally, the long-term challenges that we've been having is we all understand that our children need routines and consistency, and COVID-19 really has created and impacted that process. So as much as, you know, adults have had to pivot and adjust to the COVID-19 changing situations, it creates a lot of issues for our schools trying to maintain that normalcy and consistency for our students. So we really appreciate the opportunity today to share with you folks what the challenges have been with public charter schools. And like EOEL, we continue to work through with our teachers and our EAs and our schools, and they're really the heroes in this situation. So I look forward to any questions you folks may have. And at this point, I'll pass it on to our next colleague. Ben Naki.
Yeah,
Hi.
our next presenter will be Head Start.
Can you advance slide, please? Just to the title slide. Aloha and good morning. My name is Ben Naki. I'm the president of the Head Start Association of Hawaii. I'm also the vice president of early child education programs at Parents and Children Together, which is one of the 6 early Head Start providers in Hawaii. I've been asked today to provide an update on Head Start in the state. However, I'd like to start with a brief summary of what Head Start is. Head Start's a federally funded comprehensive early child education program that focuses services on children of low-income families and is designed to address children and families' emotional, social, health, nutritional, and psychological needs. Services are centered around the child, but encompass the entire family. Early Head Start are for families with children under the age of 3, including prenatal mothers, whereas Head Start are for families with children ages 3 to 5 years old, with the emphasis on children who are preparing to enter kindergarten. Services are delivered through multiple options depending on the provider. Those options are center-based classroom settings, through family childcare homes, through partnerships with private childcare providers, through home visiting, and now more recently, due to the pandemic, through remote learning and virtual family engagement activities, similar to what you've heard today from EOEL as well as the charter schools. Early Head Start programs throughout the state promote each child's individual development through services that support early learning, health, and family well-being. Next slide. Oh, this slide, perfect. These are the 6 providers located throughout the state. So as you can see on the island of Oahu, we have Honolulu Community Action Program and Parents and Children Together, who are both early Head Start and Head Start providers. On Kauai, you have Child and Family Services, who provides Head Start and early Head Start. On Maui, you have Maui Economic Opportunity, which provides Head Start services. Maui Family Support Services provides early Head Start services. And on Hawaii Island, you have Parents and Children Together, who provides Head Start and early Head Start services, and Family Services Hawaii, who provides early Head Start services. Next slide, please. So on this slide, just wanted to provide you all with some numbers as far as the current status of our Head Start programs throughout the state. And again, this is for our programs that provide services to 3 to 5-year-olds. As you can see, right now there's a total of 1,544 3 to 5-year-old children being served throughout the state. In-person services, however, there's about 156 kids that are being serviced in person in a classroom setting. As you can see, 2 centers are open on Kauai, 1 on Oahu, 6 on Maui, and 1 on Hawaii Island. The ratios are smaller than usual. Usually our class size is around 20. All the centers here, we're talking about 10 and below. And so majority of the services are being provided virtually alongside mainly through family engagement opportunities, as well as dropping off or mailing packets to families to provide them with some activities they can do at home. So this is our Head Start, kind of where we're at. The next slide, please. This is the current status of our Early Head Start program, which is our prenatal. It says 5-year-old, but I apologize, that's a typo. It should say prenatal to 3 years old. So these are our very, very young children. Right now, currently, we are serving across the state 477 Early Head Start children and prenatal moms. About half are being served virtually. 271 being serviced virtually, and 103 being served in person. The count here also has a home visiting count, which is also a virtual count too. And just to be clear for the Head Start providers, we're all independent agencies. And so decisions around reopening, what kind of services we want to provide is all dictated at the program level or at the agency level. So some places might be reopening earlier than others, but it's purely a local decision by the agencies. Next slide, please. So I wanted to just take a minute to, next slide, please. Thank you. So just wanted to take a minute to explain some of the challenges our providers have been having. Probably the first one is around staffing, readiness of staff to resume in-person services, coverage, because all of our agencies have been under the guise, if people are sick, if staff are not feeling well, or people in your household are not feeling well, we ask you not to come to work. Of course, that'll impact the ability to provide coverage in the classrooms. And our coverage is, we always have 2 adults in a classroom, usually a teacher and an assistant. In Early Head Start, it's usually 2 qualified teachers. And so staffing, of course, just qualified staff in the early child education field has always been one of the challenges. More so with COVID, we're having to deal with not a lot of people applying for jobs that are being posted. Childcare options for staff. So we have had a lot of staff that are using FICRA leave because they have they have kids that have to stay home because their schools are in a virtual environment. And so we've had staff that have to work from home or are not able to come in because they are managing their own childcare for their own personal families. Other challenges is around services, meeting the needs of families despite remote learning. Recently I had some conversations with parents, and a lot of I think the frustration parents have is they want to get on a virtual call, they want to get onto a Google Classroom, but they have multiple children who have multiple schedules. And so that sometimes is frustrating for our families. We've been hearing is how to get my teenager and my elementary school age child on one call, and then I got to get on a call with my home visitor for Head Start. And so that's some of the frustrations that we've been hearing as far as we try to engage our families. Also partner organizations readiness, and this is mainly around facilities. A lot of the facilities we have across the state are on the DOE campuses, which all have different timelines right now on reopening of their schools. But we also have other organizations we partner with to provide center-based care or center-based services. And some of those partner organizations are at different levels of allowing people from outside onto their campuses or onto their property at the time. Again, connecting with families remotely and virtually, I kind of talked about that when we talked about services. Recruitment of new families. Our recruitment is continuous throughout the year. We have a federal mandate about our enrollment of how many kids we need to serve throughout the year. And it's been tough recruiting new families because new families are not necessarily want to be engaged virtually. And on the other end, they want childcare or they need a classroom setting, but some of our classrooms are not open. So it's for us, it's a little bit challenging to try to recruit families as well as meeting federal mandates. Although the federal mandates have been allowing us a lot of flexibility due to the pandemic. Next slide, please. This is my last slide, and I talked a little bit about this earlier in the previous slide, but just some challenges that families have have talked to us about around the multiple remote and virtual learning, multiple children remote learning. You know, we've talked to families, and families are feeling burnt out. And a lot of it is around some of the things we have in the last bullet here around access, availability and navigation of resources. And so our programs, I think we do a good job of identifying food distribution sites, assistance, federal financial assistance programs, or mental health services that families can have access to. It's the access piece, and also the understanding of how to navigate those resources, which sometimes can be cumbersome for families. Technology needs, we do have some of our programs across the state have been able to use some federal COVID money to purchase technology for families. However, families, some of our families are not accustomed to using that technology. And so there is a learning curve that our staff have to work with families on in order to access virtual or remote learning activities. And then loss of employment. A lot of our families are, you know, we do, our primary work is with families who are living at or below federal poverty guidelines, which for a family of 4 right now, that's about $30,000, a little bit more than $30,000. We also focus a lot on homeless families and families that are in foster care. And some families have been losing employment because they don't have childcare, because of business cutbacks and whatnot. And so, you know, our program is there to support them, not just necessarily only with the education of their child, but also to ensure the family is in a good space, is able to make good decisions for their family, and is also able to access resources in their community to kind of help them navigate through the pandemic. And in closing, you know, I talked to the other colleagues, my 5 other colleagues who run Early Head Start and Head Start, and we're all very committed to continue to provide services throughout the pandemic for the vulnerable families that we serve. And I'd like to thank you for your opportunity to provide this update on Head Start. At this time, I'd like to turn it over to Director Kathy Betts.
Thank you, Ben. Good morning, everybody. Good morning, Chair Woodson, Chair Yamane, Vice Chairs, members of the committees. Kathy Betts, Director for the Department of Human Services. Thank you also for this opportunity to share what the Department of Human Services has done to ensure continued childcare in Hawaii during the pandemic. You know, I recognize that working families are far from thriving at the present moment with multiple stressors that they're facing in their personal and daily lives. However, the pandemic has really highlighted the need for us to support more childcare efforts so that our children can have a thriving future. Today, next slide, please. Today, I'll be presenting with Dana Balansag, Program Administrator for the Child Care Program Office. Next slide. So just by way of brief background, I'd like to share just a few slides about DHS and who we are. We are comprised of 6 state offices, 4 major divisions, 2 attached agencies, 2 attached commissions, and the Governor's Coordinator on Homelessness. At peak employment, we would have roughly around 2,400 employees. We are the state's social safety net that provides food assistance, rental assistance, public housing, vocational training and education, as well as child protective and adult protective services. But today I'll be focusing on our provision of childcare supports. Next slide, please. Thank you. One of our foundational tenets is found in the Hawaii State Constitution. We have an obligation found in Article 9, Section 3 to serve the residents of the state who are in need of assistance. Another foundational tenet of the department is that we work with the Aloha Spirit in mind. Our team thoughtfully embeds the Aloha Spirit in all that they do. And I think that's been really exemplary during this time. I know that we've all been working nonstop for the last 9 months, but what I've found is that our team has been really focused on serving the residents of Hawaii to the best of their ability. Next slide, please. Thank you. So in 2019, we were able to codify our multi-generational approach to reducing intergenerational poverty. So we've been embedding this process into our systems and procedures to ensure that we serve the whole family. And part of that is truly breaking down our own silos and approaching our work with a solutions-based mindset. So just a brief overview of the childcare programs in DHS. The Childcare Connection of Hawaii is federally funded through the CCDBG, which is the Child Care Development Block Grant Act of 2014. Preschool Open Doors is state funded, created in state statute, and that was recently amended by Act 46 of 2020 session, which endeavored to expand POD on several fronts. We've got childcare licensing, and the purpose through CCDBG is to really focus on health, safety, and quality. As I mentioned, Child Care Connection of Hawaii is federally funded. It's authorized through the Child Care and Development Block Grant and funded through the Child Care and Development Fund. So eligible children are ages birth through 12 years old. Parents are required to have some sort of activity, i.e. employment or attending school or job training. There is a family copay. So it's a sliding scale copay of 10 tiers. And it's based on family choice. So the provider is selected by the family that best meets the needs of the family and the child. So that's DHS regulated or an exempt provider. And this is really focused on low income families. We've had several waivers that will go into more detail further in the presentation. Next slide, please. Preschool Open Doors, it's state funded. So in state fiscal year 2020, we served 1,435 families and 1,455 children served. That was authorized by Act 169 in Session Laws of Hawaii 2013, and it was amended by Act 46 last session. So that's for eligible children the year prior to kindergarten entry. There's no activity requirements for parents, and also based on family choice. So the family selects the group childcare center or group home, i.e. preschools that best meets the need of the family and the child. For state fiscal year 2020, the state appropriation was 11.6 million for POD subsidies. And as I mentioned, those are the amounts of families and children that we served. So just a quick overview of the licensing requirements under CCDBG and childcare licensing. Next slide, please. DHS provides background checks, building, fire, and sanitation inspections, oversees education and experience of staff, also has safe sleep requirements, health requirements for children, and oversees enforcement and potential prosecution for noncompliance with these requirements. Next slide, please. And here's some of our childcare quality initiatives. So for providers, we've provided accreditation and facilitation support for family childcare providers, training for childcare providers, including training for infant and toddler ages, recruitment and retention supports for family childcare providers, statewide childcare resource and referral services in consumer education, nutrition consultation training, menu reviews for childcare centers. And then we also maintain the early childhood registry and provide financial supports for early childhood education or child development coursework. The federal funding provides between the ranges of 20 and 31 million to the state. And although Congress has not determined the amount for federal fiscal year 2021, for federal fiscal year 2020, the appropriation was approximately 31 million. And that's the funding that provides funding for the Child Care Connection Hawaii program. Next slide, please. So this is an overview of last year's child care appropriations. So through the CARES Act, 11.9 million in additional funding. That was, we've expended a little over 2 million. We have until 2022 to encumber those funds, and 2023 to actually expend those funds. Act 9, HMS 302, we've expended 6.6 million with contract encumbrances. Also Act 9 for HMS 305, we've expended 16 million. Also Act 9, the CRF funds, we contracted with our community partner, Hawaii Community Foundation, to provide childcare facility grants. So we were able to expend 11.3 million And then there was an administrative fee for HCF, and we will be lapsing a little bit more than $3 million. For the $5 million appropriated via Act 46 last session, that was to manage the Act 46 data requirements, and those will be encumbered by the end of state fiscal year 2021. I'm now going to go ahead and turn this over to Dana Balansag, and then I'll close out the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, chairs, committee members. We wanted to share a little bit about the childcare landscape during COVID-19. Next slide, please. So childcare facilities and homes. By November 2020, about 93% of childcare facilities and homes have reopened. 5% of childcare facilities and homes did permanently close. 14% of childcare facilities and homes reported that they were increasing their monthly childcare rates. And of those 14%, 35% said that the increase in the rates was permanent or for an indefinite unknown period of time. Next slide. For the childcare providers, department also issued the guidelines for childcare facilities. We developed these guidelines with the work group for health and safety measures to reduce the risk to children, staff, and families. The guidelines are very comprehensive based on CDC, Department of Health recommendations. Part of it includes like separate and stable childcare groups, maintaining stable staffing so that they don't mix together, and increase cleaning measures and safety protocols. We also worked with the Hawai'i Emergency Management Agency and legislators for the distribution of PPE and ensuring that childcare providers would be able to be one of those priority groups to order those supplies through Ha'ima's website. And then we also worked on increasing the DHS childcare subsidy payment rates. So between April and November 2020, over almost $23 million in childcare subsidies have been issued, and about $19 million of that has gone to the regulated childcare providers and school-age providers. Next slide. DHS, we've also issued the Emergency Childcare Services Contract, which is utilizing those CARES Act CCDF funds. 171 contracts have been awarded, totaling $2 million thus far. We also used the Act 9, $15 million that was appropriated by the legislature to create the Child Care Grant Program. We had to develop administrative rules for the grant program, and those were adopted and are effective until January 1, 2021, because they were developed through an interim rulemaking process. We partnered with Hawaii Community Foundation to administer the contract for that grant program. So we had to develop the contract scope language, execute it, and then Hawaii Community Foundation was able to send out the information about the applications for these grant awards, and 115 providers statewide received $11.3 million in grant funds. Next slide. So of those, for the for the 44% for the DHS Childcare Emergency Contract Services, 44% of the eligible services did apply for these emergency childcare services contracts that DHS administered. 89% of those applicants were found eligible for contract awards. And then 45% of the applicants had also indicated they applied for other financial supports, including like the Paycheck Protection Program loan. Hawaii Community Foundation also had a private grant program for family child care providers, the Economic Injury Disaster Loan, as well as other financial assistance programs. Next slide. So initiatives for families that the department undertook during COVID-19, the Child Care Connection Hawaii subsidy program, we temporarily increased the maximum child care payment rates. So we increased it up to $2,000 a month for infant toddler center care. up to $1,500 a month for accredited childcare centers, i.e. preschools, and up to $1,200 a month for non-accredited preschools. We also allowed the childcare subsidy assistance during school day hours when children were doing distance learning, and that information we did have to consult with the federal government because the CCDBG law actually prohibits paying for childcare during school day hours. So with consultation with them, we were able to apply this temporary clarification for our program. Next slide. And then also with the Child Care Connection Hawaii program, we waived the income eligibility requirements for families that have been impacted by the pandemic. We also waived the activity requirement for families that have been impacted by the pandemic, such as job loss, they've been furloughed or reduced hours. We also waived the DHS family copay and have been providing the maximum subsidy benefit that families are eligible for when they have been impacted by the pandemic. So all of these waivers we had to apply for and receive approval from the federal government to do these. Next slide. And then for our Preschool Open Doors program, we did extend the open application period for an additional 1.5 months. And we allowed applicants to update their information if they were impacted financially, such as having reduced income due to the pandemic. We also allowed the POD families to receive subsidies to maintain their child's seat at the preschool during fiscal 2020. Even during lockdown, some of the preschools did decide they had to stop doing care and in order to support the providers and the families to maintain child stability, we allowed the subsidies to be paid to hold the child's seat. Next slide. And then we also applied the same temporary DHS maximum child care payment rates for the Preschool Open Doors program. So $1,500 a month for the accredited preschools and up to $1,200 a month for the non-accredited preschools. And then for the state fiscal year 2021 program, we allowed the families more time to find their preschool, since either some of the families weren't necessarily comfortable sending their children back yet, or some of the preschools were having a little bit of lower enrollment, so they may not have been able to take all of the families and children that were interested in utilizing the preschool. Next slide, and I'll turn it back over to Director Betts.
Thank you. Finding the unmute. Thanks, Dana. All right, so we've obviously all faced pretty unprecedented challenges by the COVID-19 pandemic. Next slide, please. Oh, let's see. Sorry, I'm getting my own slides messed up. We experienced a 100% increase in applications received during April to October 2020 versus the same period in 2019. A 290% increase in the amount of subsidies issued during July to November 2020 versus the same period in 2019, and a 60% increase in the number of families served during July to November 2020 versus the same period in 2019. Next slide, please. So you can see, this is just a graph of the surge in applications. And this is likewise across all of our benefits and services throughout the department. We've experienced significant surges with SNAP, TANF, MedQuest, and as well as childcare. So next slide, please. As with other safety net programs, the Child Care Connection Hawaii program has experienced a surge in applications received, as well as the numbers of families that are eligible for and receive their subsidies due to temporary waivers that DHS has implemented to support families and children throughout the pandemic. We've been having continued online dialogue with our contracted provider about a variety of strategies to help manage through the surge. And we're looking at ongoing ways to support our contracted provider as well as the families through the challenges. You can see that we have experienced strained vendor capacity. We've had staffing turnover. We haven't been able to fill all the vacancies with our contracted provider. Sometimes there are just incomplete applications where we have to follow up with applicants in order to verify the information provided. And we also have to oftentimes do telephone confirmation with applicants to ensure that the applications are verified and have all of the correct information. Next slide, please. So we have faced various constraints and changes to the way that we do business. We've had to reduce our face-to-face services at offices statewide. We delayed implementation of ongoing federal CCDBG Act requirements. However, we still continued promulgating our administrative rules for childcare payments, requirements for listing of exempt center-based providers, and background checks. We did have a public hearing on November 4th, 2020. We're also continuing to work with our community providers and with the Department of Health to ensure childcare providers and staffing are prioritized in the vaccination distribution. These are our providers that have been providing care for our essential workers' children since the very beginning of the pandemic, and it's absolutely crucial that they're protected in the work that they do. Next slide, please. And we recognize that DHS is facing unprecedented times. And as we know, the childcare crisis and governmental budget crisis is nationwide. Our childcare program office is at half capacity. Via Act 4612 of the full-time positions were not funded. And the A-fund match for 4 positions in CCPO were also defunded. So we're continuing to work at capacity, as Dana has mentioned, to ensure that the residents are provided the services that they need. I mean, childcare is absolutely more crucial than it ever has been before, so we absolutely recognize that. Next slide, please. So some additional COVID-19 challenges. Although Act 46 was innovative and creative, it was passed during an economic downturn, and so there was no appropriation to expand the POD program to serve 3-year-olds. So we've been working with our IT data system modifications and admin rule changes to ensure that we can build out the data system necessary to support the requirements in Act 46. However, we have not been able to hire or contract for certain positions that are necessary for this implementation. Next slide, please. For our IT transformation, we'll be using the $5 million in CCDBG federal funds. And I have to note that these are distinct and separate from CARES Act funds and the coronavirus relief funds. In addition to any private sector funds to assist in expanding our data infrastructure for purposes of managing the information collected pursuant to Act 46 from last session. Next slide, please. So we obviously need to enhance our current system. We're working on integrating with other data systems to ensure data is being used in the most effective and efficient ways to ensure good outcomes for children in childcare. And the pandemic has really highlighted the childcare crisis for all of us, but we have an opportunity and an obligation to help rebuild these systems and ensure safe and adequate childcare is provided for our keiki. We're happy to answer any questions at this time. Mahalo for your time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you to all the presenters. I will be turning it over to Chair Woodson.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, presenters, for being here today. Members, you should have received the responses to everyone's, to your inquiries in an email this morning, along with the presentations. If you have not had a chance to review those responses, please go ahead and indicate that you have a question in the chat, and we'll make sure that your questions get answered during this forum. Apologies again for being late, mechanical issues on our plane. While members, you take a look to see if you have those responses and you can have a chance to look at them, I will just provide a little bit of a backstory. So this informational briefing today, as you have heard, is a joint hearing between the new proposed committees on education and health, human services, and homelessness. And as you have heard, some of the early learning programs are in fact housed in DHS. And also, as it has become apparent, there's going to be a lot of collaboration between our agencies to make sure that we fully support those that are youngest amongst us. This is also appropriate because as you see in other high-performing systems, like in Singapore, as an example, you will see that the Ministry of Education works closely with the Ministry of Social and Family Development, and they really integrate their support services and systems to make sure that they are fully supporting their young ones. I mentioned Singapore, of course, because they have one of the most effective educational and support systems in the entire planet. And so I point that out because it's something for us to aspire to. Here in Hawaii, of course, statutorily speaking, we have the Executive Office of Early Learning, which is responsible for really collaborating and coordinating early learning opportunities across the state. And as was mentioned, we have Act 46, which statutorily prescribes that DHS will work in collaboration with EOEL and other service providers to expand high quality early learning opportunities across our great state. And with that, we do have some individuals that have questions. So I'll start off with Chairman Takumi.
Thank you very much, Chair. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay. Yeah, I did send a series of questions and I didn't get, I'll look for the email because you're saying that all the questions that people asked were being responded to by the respective departments?
That is correct. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So I think the 500-pound gorilla in the room is about the current economic situation we're in. As you well know, Chair, Act 46 required that there be a ramp up of all eligible 3- and 4-year-olds in the state, 50% in 5 years and 100% in 10 years. Knowing that this is part of a whole joint package passed by the legislature, what support is needed for the implementation of Act 46 over, say, the next 5 years? And does the providers out there, the departments, are they optimistic that the legislature is going to appropriate hundreds of millions of dollars to expand POD to the degree it can be a universal program?
Before the department weighs in, let me provide a little bit of backstory. So this year, the legislature passed a bill to expand early learning opportunities by utilizing an array of providers, both in the public and private sector. And so that proposal dictated that we expand early learning opportunities over 12 years. Initially, it was 10 years. We wanted to allow for 2 years to get through COVID. And so if you take a look at the proposal in the first sets of provisions, it does indicate that over the first 2 years, that time would be allotted for the various departments to set up the structures that are needed to go forward with expansion. As Director Betts indicated with regards to making sure that we set up the systems for data collection, we need systems set up in the Department of Education for experiences as it relates to their early learning opportunities, so we can collect that data to see which programs are effective and which programs are not. And so right now, where we are in the process is setting up the infrastructure in the Department of Education and the Department of Human Services. The Executive Office of Early Learning is already good to go with regards to their infrastructure. They're able to expand, as is Head Start. And so where we are right now is we're going to allow the departments the time to set up their systems, make the funding requests. Once they figure that out next year or the year thereafter, then the idea is the legislature to appropriate funds so that we can move forward expeditiously with that expansion at that point. And so,
yeah, Chair, let me interrupt you. I apologize, but if I could hear from, for example, the Department of Human Services and also the EOEL, because if you can believe the newspapers, and you don't believe it's fake news, the economic forecast that we've seen is that tourism won't return to 2019 levels until 2025. So we're talking about 5 years out before even tourism, not to mention other sectors of our economy, are going to kind of be at the point where we were last year. So if this is supposed to ramp up in the next 2 years, and I also heard Director Betts saying that positions and funds were not filled because the funding was not released. And so I don't see how they can ramp up to prepare for this when they don't have the warm bodies to actually effectuate the change. I don't know if I heard it wrong. Maybe the positions have been filled and they're well on their way of laying the framework for this. So if the departments can respond to those concerns, I'd appreciate it.
And before you respond, thank you for that, Mr. Chairman. And so if you also, the departments can speak about some of the conversations that you're having with the federal level. I've been talking with some of the incoming administration members, and there is a keenness of making sure that we support our early learning opportunities, especially pre-kindergarten and preschools. And so departments, if you also are hearing or are having conversations with our allies on the federal level as to how we can fill some of those funding gaps. Okay, whoever wants to go first. Thank you.
Thanks, Chair Woodson. That was a wonderful question from Representative Takumi. I think that it is absolutely, we do see the writing on the wall that implementation of the provisions of Act 46 will be delayed. POD is a general funded program. It's a state funded program, state created. There were 12 full-time positions created under Act 46 that did not receive any appropriations. So those we were not able to establish those positions without general funds. But however, and this goes towards your last questions about how we've been trying to be creative and innovative as much as possible during these difficult times. We are in communications with U.S. Health and Human Services Agency for Children and Families. We are looking at examples of private partners loaning or providing IT professionals to assist state government to modernize IT system. We do still have the $5 million in CCDBG federal funds that we'll be using to make data modifications to our systems. And so we just need to continue going down the road of implementation. We want to be able to implement the will of the legislature, but I also recognize that we are in a very dire economic crisis that we have never been in before. So I hope that answers the question.
I'd also like to thank Rep. Takumi for that great question. I think as with most projects, expansion is going to take significant financial investment. However, there are things that we can do as a community in order to move forward on some of the goals of Act 46. We've already begun working on MOUs and MOAs on data sharing agreements with our fellow agencies so that when funds are available, implementation can move that much quicker. Beyond this, EOEL joins community partners to support the early care and education sector during this really difficult time. We're focused on maintaining seats and supporting providers wherever we're able to. And we're also focused on increasing families' access to assistance such as Preschool Open Doors and Child Care Connection Hawai'i. Finally, we're also continuing to focus on our work with higher education to strengthen pathways with respect to early childhood education as a profession. And while this may not lead immediately to expansion, they do lay the groundwork for us to move forward with expansion when financial investments are greater. I really want to point out, though, that Act 46 is going to take significant investment, both financially and in terms of time over the next decade, in order to make sure that we're addressing what we need to do. There needs to be significant investment in supporting the workforce. And we also need investment in expansion of programs as well as facilities. We've already done a lot of work with respect to projecting costs and logistics around expansion of our EOEL public pre-kindergarten program, in addition to opportunities, and we can share information on this if you'd like. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Director and Executive Director. Members, is there anyone else that has questions? I see Majority Leader Belatti.
Thank you, Chair. I just have a couple of clarifying questions about the Preschool Open Doors program, as well as the fact that my understanding is Hospital 2543 actually set up the special fund so that the department will be able to receive, as appropriated from the legislature, various funds, including federal funds should they come down. Before we go to that question, though, just to clarify, Director Betts, you know, it makes it sound like we're not funding currently childcare programs, preschool programs, but we are with $20 million, right? That's the current combination of cash support as well as preschool open doors support. And that's a combination of federal funds and A funds as well.
That's a wonderful question, Representative Bellotti. We are absolutely funding childcare as much as we can, and we are hopeful that more federal funding will be able to support childcare expansion. However, Preschool Open Doors, as I did mention, is a state-funded program, and I absolutely recognize the economic situation we find ourselves in.
Okay, so right there, that if I could just follow up there, the legislation we just passed will allow for the legislature to appropriate essentially different kinds of funds, so that Preschool Open Doors is no longer just, I really want you to be careful about that, because when we talk about funding for these programs, right, as we look at the federal landscape, the proposals that the Biden-Harris administration have actually put out there and cited to include the expanding the CDBG grant, right? So that's exactly funneling it into these areas where we have expansion.
Right, but just want to also remark that the CCDBG is a block grant, so we do require a state match in order to actually expend the federal funds. But absolutely correct, we do have that special fund associated with Act 46 that if we could have, you know, private funders or special funds, that would definitely help us with this cause.
And then just one last follow-up question: what is the state match for the grant, the block grant?
I'm going to have to go back to my slide.
Okay, I'll follow up later. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you, Majority Leader, and just members, for the edification of everyone. I think currently Preschool Open Doors is at $11.6 million. CCCH is somewhere between, if I recall, 20 million. The Preschool Open Doors, by the way, is state funds, A funds, as Majority Leader had indicated. CCCH is at 20 to $30 million. That is all federal funding, and EOEL, Executive Office of Early Learning, is at about 8.95 million. That is also A funds. And so what Majority Leader was indicating is there are potential opportunities with grant funding that is proposed in the incoming administration. Also $775 million for other types of funding for other early learning opportunities. So the potential is there, along with some of our private sector partners that have verbally indicated that they want to support this effort to make sure that we move forward as fast as we can with expansion. Members, are there any other questions? I see a question from Chairman Yamane.
Hello, thank you. This is for Director Betts. You know, with the proposed budget that's coming out, that will be publicly released later on this week, or next week, actually. What are some of the proposed changes, and how will things like furloughs and further internal reductions that might be placed on the department will impact these two programs?
Thank you, Chair Yamane. I apologize, I can't actually respond to that question at this point, but I can recognize that we are in a tough fiscal crisis at this point, and we're going to have to be making some difficult decisions in order to make it through the biennium.
Okay, so I know you can't comment until the 21st, but okay, so then with that being said, then, so some of these monies that, for example, like Act 9, Act 46, there were some requests for A and N monies. Are there any restrictions that will be placed on the balance, the current leftover balance on that? And will that then be redirected for other needs? Or are there assurances that that balance will remain specifically for your use for the designated purposes?
Unfortunately, with Act 9, we did have removal of the A funds from some of the positions for CCPO. For the 11.9, the additional CCDBG funds from the federal government, we can use those for other emergency purposes, in addition to the child care grants to providers. So that is an option.
Okay, Because I have here, isn't there a remaining balance of $6.6 million? Or that was expended, right? Out of in your presentation regarding what was appropriated?
Correct. That was for HMS 302. That was,
Yeah, so that's 6.6 estimated with a ceiling of 11, right? So is that meaning you have roughly around 5 million to last you till 2022?
correct. That would be for continued general support for childcare.
Well, okay. So, okay. Yeah, so I guess it's hard, you know, I guess some of those questions regarding the future of the programs, whatever, is going to be a balancing act between, you know, your administration and the legislature. So, yeah, I guess that is hard to discuss future movement regarding the impact of a potential furloughs, right? Which would impact about what 9.3 at best regarding your fiscal issuance, and then also the 10% withholding currently, right, within your administration. Is that all been encumbered into your proposed budget cuts for the next biennium?
We are looking at, you know, proposed budget cuts for the next biennium. Correct.
Okay. Well, thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Representative Ichiyama. Representative, you are muted. If you can please unmute.
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you.
Thank you, Chair. Apologize. This question is for DHS, either Director Betts or for Dana Balansag. I was wondering, you know, we talked a little bit about the child care providers for 0 to 5. I was wondering if you could speak to about child care for school-age children, specifically A+. I know that DHS uses some of its TANF funds for DOE contracted A+ providers. I've heard from the community that they are having a difficult time, schools deciding on an individual basis whether or not to reopen, how many students to bring back. Would either of you be able to speak to that situation?
So this is Dana Balansag. Our division does do the contract with the Department of Education for TANF funds to reimburse DOE for A+ monthly cost, monthly tuition for eligible TANF eligible families. However, the Department of Education is the one to run the A+ program. DHS doesn't run it. It's DOE, so DOE has to make certain decisions about how they would be operating the A+ program and discuss that with DHS.
I guess just to follow up, have you heard from any A+ providers about any difficulty that they're experiencing in reopening their programs?
So Child Care Program Office, we have been working with the A+ providers on those DHS emergency child care contracts, and also the Hawaii Community Foundation, the Child Care Grant Program. Unfortunately, my office doesn't oversee the contract with DOE, so that is a different office. And just in conversation with them, you know, it's been up to the DOE to make certain decisions about the A+ program. And I think that's the challenge, is that DOE isn't necessarily ready to make that discussion, because maybe they might be focused on the distance learning and reopening, and maybe now the furlough plan. So I think it's definitely continued conversation between DHS and DOE about what challenges the A+ providers have, but it hasn't necessarily been as much communication because the DOE might be focused on other aspects right now.
Well, thank you, Dan. I appreciate that. I just wanted to add that I've heard from A+ providers that they are really in dire financial straits because they run off of program fees collected from students who participate in the program. And with many schools not bringing students back, they've really had to dig into their reserves, and they want to keep their qualified staff But if schools do not start bringing students back on campus, then they don't have customers. And so I think that they're definitely in a unique struggle because they are really at the whim of the individual schools that they work with. I just wanted to share that with the committee. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Representative. I'm going to go to Representative-elect Capella and then Majority Leader Bellotti thereafter.
Thank you very much, Chair. And thank you to all of the presenters. I had a question that I wanted to follow up with on vaccines for childcare providers. I know that you folks touched on this and said that you were working with DHS, but I know that the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine recently recommended that childcare workers and operations be included in the second tier of vaccinations for essential businesses that allow other essential, just specifically because they allow other essential workers to be able to go to work. So I just wanted to be really clear and ask, are we following those recommendations in Hawaii by including childcare operations to be in that tier for the state's vaccine plan, if you know?
Thank you, Representative-elect Capella. That would really be within the jurisdiction of Department of Health, but we have suggested that that childcare workers and staff members be included in that 1B portion of the plan for rollout of vaccination.
Perfect, thank you. Chair, I'm sorry, I have one more follow-up question for EOEL. I know that you folks touched on the fact that there have been staffing reductions, in part because people aren't applying for jobs or the open positions, but do you anticipate COVID-19 having a long-term impact specifically on the recruitment of qualified early learning professionals and teachers and childcare professionals as well?
Thank you for that question. I'm going to ask my educational specialist, Colleen Momohara, to address that question.
Thank you.
Hi, can you hear me?
We can hear you now.
I'm not sure what happened to my video, but as far as the public pre-K side, I'm not sure if that question might be related to some of the other programs that might have had some staffing issues. For the public pre-K program, the issues center more around the workers who are part of the Department of Education. And so there, if the teachers and the educational assistants are part of that group. And currently, there hasn't been necessarily more or less challenges. That some of the challenges are just because of the workforce issue around early childhood per se. And definitely the more remote areas tend to have a more difficult time recruiting folks. But that's also just a natural part of being in education. It's harder to find folks in those areas or people willing to travel out to those areas, per se. So I'm not sure if that question is more related to some other pieces related to like substitutes that Yvonne mentioned and charters. So I'm just trying, I guess I'm trying to clarify if that was what you were referring to.
You answered my question. Thank you. In part, I appreciate it. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you, Representative-elect Majority Leader Bellotti.
Thank you, Chair. It was really good to hear from EOEL and charter schools that plans for reopening were underway. And I know that the public schools are starting to head into their finals weeks and that they're actually going to be closing down for winter break. But when we come back in January, I think I heard Lauren say that more schools will be opening up, more of the pre-kindergartens. And I just wanted to know, are those the majority of the pre-K schools, pre-K classrooms in the DOE and within charter schools? Because as I understand it, and as we've seen from the experience of the private school sector, is that many of the preschools actually, in fact, never shut down. and that they did figure out the ways in which to safely bring back our youngest students. I know that the in-person learning is so critical for the younger students. So across the nation, we've seen those classrooms open up first. And I just wanted to know the status and the progress come January.
Sure, thank you for that question. Within the presentation, we mentioned that 85 of our classrooms are already opened and providing face-to-face learning. We do plan to work with the rest of the schools that we work with to reopen in January. And I'm gonna ask Colleen to elaborate on that.
Yeah, so we started off the year with about 2/3 of the classrooms were face-to-face, and we actually worked with the schools because we want to make sure that the principals themselves felt that it was safe enough for kids to come onto campus as well as to open the classrooms. So, and progressively through the past few months, more classrooms have gone face-to-face because that has been the intent. And part of, because that was our intention from the very beginning, was to provide face-to-face experiences for children, since that's the program itself. We purposely looked at the number of children within the classroom setting and what kind of supports the teachers and EAs educational assistants, would need in order to do this safely with the number of kids and being in the particular classrooms that they were in. So yes, so we anticipate just about everyone. I'm just waiting for one more school to share with me their plans for reopening, but other than that, we expect schools to be face-to-face, all of them, if not but one, maybe by January.
Majority Leader, charters, we've had a few, actually 3 that have had face-to-face the whole time. We had 2 that had blended. And as we enter into January, we have more and more of them that are looking at reopening to face-to-face. You're absolutely correct that our youngest ones really work best face-to-face with their teachers. And I don't have the exact numbers yet, but I know many of them are looking at their data, depending on their communities and wanting to reopen. So I'm hoping that we'll have more of announcements coming out soon.
And then just as a bridge, sorry to share one more question. I think this actually connects back to Chair Ichiyama's question about A+ programs. In the event that, there's the ability to encourage DOE campuses to open up that portion of their A+ programs, that probably would be helpful both for essential workers who need that childcare for the rest of the day, as well as for the businesses that are struggling. And so that would be just a pitch to see if you folks could help encourage those kinds of development of programs quickly as well. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you, Majority Leader. Members, are there any other questions? Maybe as a follow-up, if we can ask DHS to also just to further clarify a status update as to how many classrooms are in fact going to be open comes January.
Would you mean childcare settings or DOE classrooms?
Specifically, with regards to the applicants that go through either CCCH or Preschool Open Doors.
So how many spots would be available or subsidies available in the month of January?
Right, compared to, again, because there have been reductions compared to pre-COVID times, in terms of a percentage, how many seats are going to be available for those 2 applicant pools?
For subsidies, we have actually experienced a surge in subsidies, in subsidy applications. So that's actually exponentially increased since this time last year. Dana, I don't know if you have information on this question from Chair Woodson.
Yeah, I'm not sure in terms of we've been able to get specific classroom numbers. We can check to see what their current enrollment might be. But again, yeah, that might continue to kind of change. It depends on the individual sites. But we can try to see if we can get that information.
No problem. Let's go in a different direction. Can you please further clarify what the differences between preschool open doors and Child Care Connects Hawaii are, so that the members have a better understanding? And as an additional part of that question, if you have a rough percentage of how many 3 and 4-year-olds are in CCCH compared to that are in preschool open doors.
Sure, thanks, Chair Woodson. So just to reiterate, and Dana can chime in as well, Child Care Connections Hawaii is federally funded through the CCDBG grant. And so that's a federally funded program for which there's a state match. For Preschool Open Doors, it's a state funded program set up through state statute in HRS 346. And then I'll let Dana chime in if she has specific numbers on 3 and 4-year-olds.
I did want to add the Preschool Open Doors program is targeted specifically for the year before kindergarten. So it's basically that set age that is really the eligible child, and the Child Care Connection Hawaii program serves children birth through up to 13 years old. And then families, the parents have activity requirements in the Child Care Connection Hawaii program. There is no parent activity requirement for the Preschool Open Doors program. And then for, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
And then for just in general, the Child Care Connection Hawaii program, families may choose different kinds of providers. So they could choose friend, family, neighbor that are not licensed by DHS or regulated by DHS. They could choose preschools, infant toddler centers, as well as school-age care. And then Preschool Open Doors is just focused on that preschool, the group child care facility centers.
Okay, and so I asked a question about the percentages because you had indicated, Dr. Betts had indicated earlier that there is in fact a surge on the CCH side that is, I guess, not only because of COVID and the financial need, but also because of the waivers that are being granted on that side. My last question is, would it make sense to also provide those waivers as it relates to Preschool Open Doors so that you can balance out the stress on the system, and thereby you're providing subsidies also for those families that are taking advantage of Preschool Open Doors?
Unfortunately, Chair Woodson, there wouldn't be enough funds in POD to be able to waive some of those requirements for the population that needs them.
Okay, that's what I thought you were going to say. Very good. Members, are there any other questions? No other questions? If not, I wanted to thank everyone for their participation today. This has been a very important discussion about early learning opportunities. And it's not just about making sure that we provide development for those that are youngest amongst us. This is also a discussion about making sure that parents can get back to work, and they cannot do that unless their children are taken care of and they have that peace of mind. Moving forward next year, I should indicate that higher education is going to be combined with technology. And so that's going to be chaired by Representative Takumi moving forward. To me, the University of Hawaii system is on a right path. We do have world-renowned programs within that system that I think should be further articulated more frequently. And so under that leadership, they are on the correct trajectory, in my humble opinion. As is the case also, in my humble opinion, as it relates to our early learning opportunities. The Executive Office of Early Learning under Director Maraguchi has done an excellent job with providing a really world-class instruction. That is in fact verifiable when you look at the data. Similarly, as it relates to Head Start and some of our other programs, even within our charter schools, they have done an excellent job. Where, in my mind, we have the biggest challenges is within our K-12 system. And that's not to say that the Department of Education is not working hard. They most certainly are. It's definitely not to say that we don't have excellent teachers or principals. We, in fact, do. It is to say, however, that our system is not set up to maximize potential. And that is true as it relates to not only our teachers and our principals, but also our students across the board. And so that's something that I would like to focus on as we move here forward in the future. And I'd like to thank the current members of the committee for their work they've done over the past 3 years to really get, in collaboration with EOEL and others, to really get our early learning system up and running. And now we're going to move forward with expansion. And I'd like to also thank University of Hawaii. Working with them, it's been a great experience. And so in 2 days, I think it is, the University of Hawaii will have an informational briefing with incoming Chairman Takayama. And with that, I'd like to thank all the presenters. Thank you for all the members for participating. And I hope everyone has a great day. Aloha.